Tonight we talk about Queen Victoria's secret, a love to passionate for a monarch. You're standing beneath the echoing arches of Windsor Castle, the air heavy with the smell of beeswax and velvet dust. The halls are silent, eerily so except for the faint creak of your own breath. Portraits of kings glare down at you, judging as they always do, while one woman's gaze seems softer, more wounded. Queen Victoria, draped in black, widowed at 42, a figure carved from grief. You might think the story is about loss, but it isn't. Not entirely. Somewhere behind that mourning veil flickers a pulse too alive for mere sorrow. You probably won't survive this, at least. Not without rethinking every solemn portrait and school book page about the mourning queen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail her through the twilight of 1861, when Prince Albert dies suddenly, typhoid, they say. Though historians still argue whether it was really something else, something quieter but deadlier. His death doesn't just close a chapter. It slams the book shut. Victoria vanishes into black. Curtains drawn. Clocks stopped. Servants forbidden to smile. Even her dog, Dash, seems to sulk through the halls. The newspapers call her the Widow of Windsor. But what they don't see are the nights she wanders the palace corridors alone. Her mind drifts always to Scotland. Balmoral, their wild refuge of wind and whiskey. The one place where Albert had made her laugh until her corset snapped. You can almost hear the Highland winds clawing at the castle eaves, begging her to return. As she does. By 1863, she's back among the pines and lochs, trying to breathe again. It's here you first notice him, a figure half in shadow, half in sunlight. John Brown, a servant, technically, a horse handler with rough hands, and the sort of blunt honesty no one ever dared to use with a queen. When he speaks, it's without the curtsies and rehearsed tones of courtiers. He calls her woman, once by accident and nearly loses his job for it. Nearly. Instead, Victoria laughs. It's the first real sound of life the household has heard in months. He brings her coffee, jokes in his thick Scottish burr, even scolds her for not wearing a shawl. The courtiers watch, horrified. But for her, it's oxygen. A friendship, they whisper. A scandal, they fear. Historians still debate whether Brown was hired by her physician or by fate itself. What's certain is that, after he arrived, the Queen's mourning began to shift. Her step quickened, her eyes warmed, and most shocking of all, she started appearing outside again. You, standing near the Balmoral gates, can almost see it, the widow walking briskly beside her servant, laughing at something no one else hears. The Victorians, of course, couldn't handle that sort of thing. A queen was supposed to embody purity, patience, duty, not passion. But in that lonely castle, miles from London's polite suffocation, the rules melted. Brown wasn't noble or polished. He was solid, real, maddeningly alive. You picture her at dusk, standing on the veranda, wind lifting her veil. Somewhere inside, a clock ticks again for the first time in years. She's not free, not yet, but something inside her shifts. The ache of widowhood begins to change shape, to hum with an entirely different kind of ache. In the soft crackle of the hearth, you sense the birth of a secret, a heartbeat no one's supposed to hear. And you're already into deep to turn back. You wake to the scent of rain on heather and the faint clatter of boots outside Balmoral's courtyard. The year is 1864, and Queen Victoria has found herself surrounded by servants who bow to deeply and speak to softly, except for one. John Brown strides through the mist with a stubborn jaw, a shock of unbrushed hair, and a look that says he's late for nothing. You watch him approach the Queen's carriage, helping her down without ceremony. His hands rough and sure. To touch a monarch, even through a glove, is to cross an invisible line. But he does it anyway. "Mind your step, woman," he mutters. You nearly drop your teacup. The stable boys gape. But Victoria, she smiles. It's been years since anyone dared to treat her like a person, not a porcelain relic of empire. Brown becomes her personal attendant, her shadow, her shield. He keeps the press at bay, her horses steady, and her temper in check. Well, almost. There's a story about him scolding her for refusing a cloak before a storm, and her snapping back that she is the Queen of England. He replies, "Then you'll be the Queen o' pneumonia if ye dinna take it." You can almost hear the collective gasp from the courtiers. Historians still argue whether Brown's insolence was affection or arrogance. But to Victoria, it was warmth. He didn't flatter. He didn't flinch. When others whispered about spiritualism and seances, those were all the rage. After Albert's death, Brown told her ghosts were nonsense and life was for the living. It was outrageous, and it was exactly what she needed. You walk with them through the damp hills, her black skirts brushing against bracken, his voice guiding her horse across the moor. He calls her Your Majesty when others are around, but in private, well, you'll never quite catch what name he uses. Some say woman, others dearie. The palace archivists later burned letters that might have confirmed it. Convenient, isn't it? Still, a few clues slipped through. One courtier described seeing the Queen laugh so hard she spilled her tea on him. Another claimed Brown once chased off a photographer with a riding crop when the man tried to capture an unbecoming pose. The Queen's response? She promoted him. By the late 1860s, London society was twitching with gossip. The papers started calling her Mrs. Brown, a joke at first, then a rumor too stubborn to die. Even Prime Minister Disraeli had to tread carefully. The monarch's affections were unpredictable, and Brown had become her gatekeeper. There's a quirkier tidbit, too. Brown insisted on carrying a flask of whiskey everywhere, claiming it kept away the damp chill. The Queen, ever proper, scolded him until she didn't. Soon enough, she was sneaking a sip from his flask during long rides. It was a small rebellion, a private toast between two souls out of step with their world. The staff at Balmoral began to talk. They said she depended on him too much, leaned on him literally. He was seen holding her arm as she climbed stairs, handing her gloves, tucking a blanket around her shoulders. Innocent gestures, perhaps, but each one chipped away at the marble pedestal of monarchy. You watch it happen slowly, tenderly. The grief that once smothered her begins to turn into something else, still fierce, but alive. She looks at Brown the way someone looks at a memory they thought they'd buried. Yet, for all their closeness, neither of them could speak aloud what everyone already suspected. So they spoke through habit, through touch, through the thousand tiny rituals of daily life. You stand outside Balmoral that night, listening to the wind whip across the granite hills. Inside, by the fire, a queen and her servant share silence that says more than any vow. The monarchy would survive this, but barely, and you can already sense the storm building on the horizon. You hear laughter low, warm, and utterly out of place in the royal corridors. It's the 1870s now, and Queen Victoria, still dressed in widow's black, is sitting beside a roaring Balmoral hearth. The flames flicker on her face as John Brown pours whiskey into two mismatched glasses. Not tea, not proper sherry. Whiskey, Scottish and unapologetic. You can almost smell the peat smoke, the faint trace of rebellion in the air. He raises his glass first. "To health, ma'am," he says. She corrects him softly. "To life, Mr. Brown. You might think the Queen of the British Empire would sip like a duchess, but tonight she gulps it like a woman, remembering she still has a pulse." The moment lingers, thick with something that isn't quite friendship and isn't quite protocol. Outside, the Highland wind howls like an audience that's been waiting years for her to take her next breath. But every breath she takes now comes with a cost. The courtiers whisper, servants exchange knowing glances, and the newspapers begin to bite. The Queen's Highland servant, one headline sneers. Another calls Brown the most powerful man in Britain. He escorts her everywhere, riding, dining, even guarding her bedroom door. The gossip swells like a marching band in the background of empire. Historians still argue whether their relationship was physical. The truth, inconveniently, is that intimacy doesn't always require scandal. But you see what the Victorians couldn't stand: a monarch behaving like a human. Still, there are letters destroyed, mostly, but fragments remain. Victoria writes that Brown is so honest, so fearless, so unselfish. You can almost hear the yearning behind those words. She praises his tender care and his faithful service. But between the lines hums the unspoken, the longing of a woman whose every touch must be witnessed, whose every sigh might make headlines. Brown doesn't seem to care. He calls the palace a cage, mocks the etiquette, even argues with ministers. Once, he locks horns with her son, the future Edward VII, who despises him. "You forget yourself," the prince hisses. Brown grins. "Aye, but at least I remember who she is." The queen sides with Brown. You can practically feel the court's collective jaw hitting the floor. There's another story, quirky but true, about Brown teaching the queen how to whistle. Yes, whistle. He says every Highland soul should know how to call the hills back home. You picture her standing outside, trying it, cheeks puffed, giggling when she fails. The most powerful woman in the world, whistling badly in the fog. Somewhere, the universe grins, but the laughter doesn't drown out the tension. Rumors drift from drawing rooms to Parliament itself. Ministers mutter about improper influence. Churchmen pray for her dignity. And caricaturists draw her hand in hand with a bearded Scot under the caption Mrs. Brown's Majesty. You can imagine Victoria's fury. She calls the press wicked, shameless, yet she never denies her affection for him. Never. At Windsor, London, Osborne, wherever she goes, Brown goes too. He guards her door with a pistol, a loyal hound in human form. If anyone comes for her, he once boasts, "They'll step over my body first." It sounds melodramatic, but he means it. The queen sleeps soundly because of that vow. Historians still puzzle over how deeply she depended on him. Was it love, or was he a living relic of Albert, the embodiment of safety? Maybe both. Maybe that's what makes it unbearable for the Victorians. Passion with no clear category. You can see her in the mirror's reflection, that night, hair unpinned, eyes tired but alive. Brown is in the next room, humming a Scottish ballad off-key. She smiles, just barely. The sound drifts through the air, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and whiskey. A monarch in love. Perhaps a widow reborn? Certainly. And you, listening from the corner of the firelight, know that something irreversible has already begun. The queen's heart has remembered its rhythm, and the empire is about to feel it. It starts with ink. Not jewels or proclamations or acts of parliament, just ink. Thick, black, and trembling across the page. You're standing in the queen's private study, and the air smells faintly of sealing wax and rosewater. On the desk lies a stack of papers she insists no one touch. Her handwriting, once neat and ceremonial, now loops wildly, unevenly. These are not decrees for empire. These are letters to John Brown. "Dearest friend," one begins. Not servant, not Mr. Brown, just friend. But you can feel how that word strains to hold something larger. She writes about the weather in Balmoral, her aching knees, her loneliness. Then, in a slip almost to intimate to be accidental, she adds, "You are ever my truest comfort, my strength." She signs it not Victoria, R.I., the signature of a queen, but simply V. Historians still argue whether those letters were love notes or something else, maternal, platonic, delusional even. But the tone is unmistakable, the guarded vulnerability of someone who knows she's breaking her own rules. You glance toward the window. Outside, a guard stands motionless, pretending not to notice the faint rustle of parchment within. Victoria's daughters gossip about her indiscretions. Her eldest, the Princess Royal, begs her to burn the letters before they bring shame on the family. The queen refuses. "They are mine," she says, "and I will decide their fate." Later, decades later, when her son Edward finally takes the throne, he does destroy many of them, yet not all. A few survive, hidden in drawers, forgotten in trunks, rediscovered by archivists with gloved hands and raised eyebrows. Their language shocks even the modern reader. "His presence cheers me more than I can say," she writes in one. "I miss his voice." There's a quirky rumor, unproven, but persistent, that Brown once dictated a note back to her because she demanded reciprocity. His writing, of course, was atrocious. "Your Majesty," he scrawled, "you're too good by half." She kept it folded in a locket. Maybe it's nonsense, but you'd like to believe it's true, wouldn't you? Meanwhile, London society gnashes its teeth. Prime Minister Disraeli, ever the charmer, tries to distract her with flattery, calling her the fairy queen. It doesn't work. Her thoughts are in Scotland. Her letters, too. But paper, like passion, has its risks. One evening, a chambermaid discovers a page that's fallen to the floor, ink smeared, signature incomplete. She hesitates, then tucks it into her apron instead of returning it. Weeks later, gossip spreads through the servant halls like a fever. The Queen's letters become legend, whispered about in back alleys and drawing rooms. The press catches wind and mocks her again as Mrs. Brown. One caricature shows her sitting on a tartan throne, clutching a shepherd's crook. You can imagine her fury when she sees it. She orders all such papers banned from palace circulation. But the damage is done. Every laugh in London becomes a tiny betrayal. Still, she keeps writing. Sometimes late at night, candle guttering, pen scratching so furiously that ink dots the carpet. She hides the letters beneath her prayer book, as though divine cover might disguise mortal longing. Historians still debate what she meant by one cryptic line, "He is my heart," though he knows it not. Some claim it's metaphor. Others those who've stood in these dim corridors and felt the ghost of her say its confession. You imagine her sealing one final letter, pressing her monogram stamp into warm wax. The scent of roses mixes with smoke. Outside, Brown's boots echo faintly across the courtyard. She listens, eyes closed, as if each step writes another sentence on her heart. And you realize you're no longer just observing a queen's secret correspondence. You're witnessing the most human thing she ever did, daring to feel, when the whole world told her not to. The trouble with secrets is that they always find an audience. You can almost hear it now, the rustle of silk, the clink of teacups, and the razor-edged tone of genteel gossip spreading through the royal corridors. Ministers clear their throats too often. Duchesses whisper into gloved hands. The Queen, they say, has lost her sense of propriety. The Queen, they say, lets a servant address her too freely. The Queen, they say, might be in love. You watch it unfold like theater. The actors are powdered, perfumed, and terrified of truth. Victoria and Brown, meanwhile, move through the performance as though unaware or simply unwilling to join the farce. He rides beside her carriage instead of trailing behind. He speaks first when courtiers hesitate. Worst of all, he contradicts them. Nonsense, he says when an equerry frets about formality. The Queen's comfort comes before your rules. You can feel the room freeze. The silence is louder than a cannon. Historians still argue whether the Queen's ministers ever considered dismissing Brown outright. Some say they tried, only to be met with her icy command, "He stays." Others claim Disraeli warned her that the monarchy's dignity was at stake. Then the monarchy may take a chill, she allegedly snapped. The phrase became whispered code among servants. Victoria's private declaration of independence. It isn't just politics that make the situation volatile, it's perception. Every gesture becomes an accusation. When Brown steadies her arm as she steps from a carriage, people see romance. When he hands her a folded shawl, they see intimacy. When she smiles at him during dinner, they see a crown slipping. There's a particularly strange tidbit that still circulates. Brown once punched a pickpocket in Windsor who dared to call him her fancy man. The man woke up with a black eye and a firm order never to mention the Queen again. The incident, naturally, reached the newspapers within days. The palace dismissed it as rumor, but the phrase fancy man lingered like smoke. The Queen, of course, read everything. She always did. Her response? She had Brown's portrait commissioned by a royal artist, a silent act of defiance. So deliberate it bordered on wicked humor. You can imagine her, sitting for the painting, glancing at the unfinished canvas and saying, "Make sure his eyes are kind." Court ladies avoided mentioning his name, but it hung in the air anyway, like perfume after someone's left the room. Brown began appearing in her journals almost daily, sometimes in trivial notes about the weather, other times in bursts of raw sentiment. Walked with dear Brown, she'd write, or felt his absence sorely. Historians still debate whether those diary entries were censored later by her children, edited to dull the tenderness. But every once in a while, a phrase slips through, and it glows like a match in fog. There's a dinner scene you can picture vividly. Victoria seated at the head of the table, dignified as ever, while Brown stands behind her chair. Someone cracks a cautious joke about Scottish loyalty. The Queen's fork pauses midair. She glances over her shoulder, catches Brown's eye, and smirks just slightly. The joke dies a swift and silent death. That's the thing about power, it can't coexist easily with affection. The monarchy runs on distance. Brown's presence collapsed it. Ministers called him insolent. Parliament mocked him. and even the public began to split, half disgusted, half enchanted by this rugged man who dared to love, or at least protect the most powerful woman alive. And yet, you can sense a quiet satisfaction in her. For all their whispers, she no longer drifts through her days like a ghost. She laughs again, sometimes too loudly. She scolds, she teases, she lives. And though propriety trembles on its foundations, you know she would rather face scandal than silence. As the lamps dim that night, you picture her walking past portraits of monarchs who ruled without joy. She pauses beneath Albert's image, tracing his painted cheek with one gloved finger, then turns toward the door where Brown waits. For a moment, her veil lifts just enough for her to breathe freely. The court will continue pretending nothing is amiss, but you and she know better. You wake to a morning thick with fog, the kind that blurs mountains into ghosts and makes the heather glisten like spilled dew. Balmoral again, her sanctuary, her rebellion, her kingdom within a kingdom. The carriages are gone, the court's chatter left behind in London. Here, at last, Queen Victoria can breathe, and walking beside her, as always, is John Brown, hat in hand, stride steady. A figure as rooted to the Highlands as the granite itself. They ride early, sometimes before dawn. You watch from a distance as they disappear into the moors, a queen and her servant without ceremony, the horse's breath steaming against the cold. No one bows here, Brown once told her. The hills dinna care for titles. She laughs at that quietly, but freely, and you can see why she returns year after year. In Scotland, she isn't majesty. She's just a woman who misses the sound of someone calling her by name. Historians still argue whether Balmoral was her escape or her defiance. Some call it her emotional fortress. Others say it was where she risked her throne for a moment of truth. But you, standing in the mist, can feel how the boundaries melt. There's no throne here, no crown, only wind, mud, and memory. One of her ladies-in-waiting once wrote that Her Majesty's countenance changes in the Highlands. She glows. Another swore the Queen even learned to cook porridge under Brown's supervision, though the result was allegedly inedible. He teased her, saying even the sheep refused it. She chased him with a spoon. You smile because, for once, so does she. Brown teaches her to hike along steep trails, to trust her footing, to greet shepherds by name. He swears by whiskey for warmth and coarse jokes for courage. The Queen who once measured her steps in ceremonial precision now returns with mud on her boots. Imagine the horror of her ladies' faces when she tracks it into the palace. But Victoria waves them off. A little dirt is honest. At night, they sit by the fire. The air hums with the scent of pine resin and smoke. Sometimes Brown tells stories half legend, half nonsense about spirits in the glens. The Queen, who once believed in seances to reach Albert, listens with tilted head, half skeptical, half soothed. You don't need spirits to feel the dead, Brown says softly. They're in the wind if you just stop to listen. And she does listen. That line, half poem, half philosophy, lingers long after the logs burn low. For her, Albert's ghost is never far away. But through Brown, she begins to love the world that's still living. There's a quirky incident recorded in a servant's diary. Brown once fell off his horse during a storm, and the Queen rushed toward him before anyone else could move. "Are you hurt, John?" she cried, forgetting protocol, forgetting everything. The servant stood frozen, a monarch kneeling in the mud beside a servant. That image alone could have cracked the monarchy, if the wrong eyes had seen it. But there, in that lonely Scottish glen, it was just a human hearts colliding under rain. Historians still debate whether this was her rebellion or her redemption. Either way, it was her truth. She began writing again, not just letters, but journal entries about the scent of the pines, the color of the locks, the strength of my dear Brown. The words sound almost prayerful. You picture her gazing over the moor at sunset, the sky bleeding amber. Brown stands behind her, silent, arms folded. She says nothing, neither does he, and somehow that quiet says everything. When they return to London weeks later, she's radiant, rejuvenated, and utterly defiant. The ministers hate it. The newspapers mock it, but the Queen of half the world carries herself like someone who has rediscovered her pulse. And in the hush of her carriage, as wheels rattle toward Windsor, she murmurs a phrase so soft you almost miss it. "Scotland keeps my heart." You find yourself in a dim chamber scented faintly of varnish and oil paint. A camera tripod stands in the corner, a curious contraption of the new age, its brass gleaming like a secret. The queen has agreed, reluctantly, to another sitting. She hates the process, the stillness, the flash, the way the lens feels like an interrogation. But today is different. John Brown stands just out of frame, his presence steadying her like an anchor. "Sit a bit straighter, ma'am," the photographer says. "She'll sit as she pleases." Brown growls from the shadows. The man nearly drops his plate glass. You stifle a laugh, but Victoria's lips twitch. The shutter clicks. A moment captured forever, the widow queen, draped in mourning, but her eyes not sad. Not entirely. They glint with something defiant, something the Victorians weren't ready to see. It's a gaze that says, "I have lived and you'll never know how much." Later, the photograph circulates. London's critics praise its composure, its gravity. But you, looking closer, see what they miss: the faint curve at the corner of her mouth, the softening in her jaw. Behind the regal mask, you glimpse the warmth of someone who has been seen not as a monarch, but as a woman. Historians still argue about the portrait's hidden meaning. Was it political rebranding, a deliberate attempt to humanize the crown after years of seclusion? Or was it a love letter in plain sight, a coded nod to the man who refused to bow too deeply? The queen begins commissioning more portraits, each one subtly rebellious. No grand jewels, no crown. Instead, she's shown in simple black, often holding a small book or glove, the same glove Brown once handed her in the rain. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's hard not to notice the quiet tenderness etched into those images. A quirky detail: one early photograph actually includes Brown's reflection in the window behind her. He wasn't meant to be there. Scholars spotted it decades later, arguing whether it was intentional or merely fate playing photographer. Either way, it became a whispered relic among royal watchers, a ghostly cameo of the queen's forbidden companion. As photography evolves, the monarchy learns to use it as propaganda. But Victoria ever contrary uses it differently. Her images grow more personal, more human. You sense that through each sitting, she's chipping away at her own myth. Brown calls her stubborn as a mule. She replies, "That is why we get along." Their bond continues to echo through the frames. When she stands beside her dogs, you notice the posture relaxed, trusting, almost rural. It's the posture of a woman shaped not by London's pomp, but by Scottish hills. And the blunt kindness of a man who treated her like anyone else. The courtiers are horrified. "Your Majesty should be seen as divine, not domestic," one protests. The queen fixes him with a look that could curdle milk. "I have no wish to be divine," she says. "Heaven has taken enough from me already." Historians still debate whether she intended that line as a reference to Albert, or to something else entirely. But Brown's shadow lingers in every brushstroke, every photograph, every stubborn refusal to pose like a goddess. In the years that follow, those images outlast their gossip. When school children generations later see her face in textbooks, they won't notice the rebellion. But you now do. You know what that faint smirk really meant. One last photo session comes to mind. She's older now. Hair silver, face lined, but her eyes still alive. Brown stands behind the camera this time, fussing with the focus, muttering in his thick accent. "Hold still, woman," he says, and the queen laughs. The sound freezes in the air, timeless, defiant, utterly human. Click. History remembers the monarch. The photograph remembers the woman. The wind at Balmoral is colder now, older, heavier, like it remembers everything. You feel it sting your face as the bells toll low across the valley. The year is 1883, and John Brown is dead. Erysipelas, they say, an infection, cruel and quick. But when the message reaches Windsor, the queen collapses before the footman can even finish his sentence. For years, he was the one who held her steady. Now, there's no one. She orders the black crepe again, though it never really left her wardrobe. The court, out of habit, begins to murmur condolences. But this time, she doesn't answer. She disappears into her chambers, locking the door for days. You stand outside, hearing nothing but the tick of a clock and, faintly, a sound like someone talking to the dead. Historians still argue what those first hours were like, whether she prayed, wept, or cursed the heavens. One account claims she asked the servants to leave his boots unpolished, as though he might still come back to wear them. Another says she had his bed made each morning for the rest of her life. Whichever is true, you can tell she's doing what she's always done, keeping him close through the rituals of monarchy, rewriting grief into ceremony. At Brown's funeral, the Queen stands apart, veiled and still. The ministers recite the proper words, but her silence swallows them whole. A faithful servant, the bishop calls him. She flinches at that. A servant, such a small word for a man who changed the orbit of her world. Later, she arranges for a life-sized statue of him to be erected at Balmoral, inscribed simply, "Friend more than servant." Loyal, truthful, brave. The phrase stirs outrage in London to personal, to raw, but she refuses to change it. "I write what is true," she tells her private secretary. There's a quieter, stranger story from that time. On the night of his burial, she allegedly ordered Brown's portrait placed on her bedside table next to Albert's, to frames, to ghosts, and one heart caught between them. The court tried to remove it once. She had it replaced before breakfast. Months later, when the grief becomes too heavy, she begins to commission small tokens. A lock of his hair, kept in a locket. A ring he once wore, now hidden beneath her glove. Her ladies-in-waiting whisper that she still speaks to him in the morning. "Good day, John," they hear her murmur before addressing the nation. Historians still debate whether this was madness or mourning, but the Queen herself would have called it loyalty. You can almost see her years later, in her final days at Osborne House, asking quietly for a strange arrangement, that something of Brown's be placed in her coffin. Her doctor, shocked, records it in his journal. When she dies in 1901, the secret becomes truth. Beneath her layers of royal velvet lies a photograph of Brown, wrapped in lace, along with a small lock of his hair. It's found only after the funeral, when the new King Edward VII, who despised Brown in life, discovers it and orders it kept silent. Yet secrets have a way of breathing long after the lid closes. There's a hush across Balmoral that evening. The wind shifts through the pines, the same wind that once tangled their laughter. The statue of Brown stands watch, rain streaking its bronze face like tears. You step closer, reading the inscription again. It feels almost like a confession carved in stone, and somewhere, in the flickering edge between legend and truth, you hear her voice, soft, weary, unashamed, saying the words she could never utter in life. "You are my freedom." Years roll forward like carriages down a muddy London street, slow, uneven, carrying the weight of too much history. The Queen is gone now, sealed in her marble tomb, and those who feared her grief finally exhale. But you know how power works. It doesn't erase, it rewrites. And before long, the quiet work of erasure begins. John Brown's name is whispered less and less in polite company. His statue at Balmoral is conveniently overlooked in royal tours. Palace staff are warned not to mention him to journalists. You watch as drawers close over his letters, trunks vanish into dusty attics, and official biographers sharpen their pens into instruments of denial. Historians still argue whether it was Edward VII or his courtiers who led the purge. What's certain is this: the new king loathed Brown, saw him as an insult carved into his family's dignity. Some accounts claim he personally ordered Brown's papers burned. Others whisper he instructed artists to paint over the man's likeness in group portraits. Either way, it's as if the palace is trying to edit emotion out of the royal record, like deleting a love story, written in invisible ink. But ink never stays invisible forever. A few decades later, a housemaid's grandson finds a box while clearing an attic near Windsor. Inside are letters, smudged, faint, but real. The handwriting is unmistakable, Queen Victoria's own. They aren't romantic in the flowery sense, no forever yours. No scandalous pledges, but the tenderness between lines is electric. She calls him my dear Brown, thanks him for his constant comfort, and signs off with a private mark only the two would know. Scholars pounce, naturally. Some insist it's evidence of platonic loyalty, the sort born of grief and dependence. Others whisper that the tone is unmistakably that of a woman in love. One even notes, half-jokingly, that no Victorian widow ever wrote so many exclamation marks to her servant. The debate spins on. Was it love? Was it obsession? Or was it something stranger, a friendship that outran the vocabulary of her century? Then comes another clue. almost theatrical in its audacity, the discovery of a gold chain buried with her, one that once belonged to Brown, found decades later during restoration. It reignites the old controversy like kindling in dry grass. The newspapers have a field day, Queen's secret confession unearthed, and the monarchy's PR team spends weeks denying, reframing, explaining. But truth has rhythm. It surfaces, sinks, resurfaces again, like breath beneath water. By the time modern historians get their hands on Victoria's journals partially edited by her daughter Beatrice, the trail has been tampered with. Whole passages are missing, replaced with careful ellipses. My dear Brown becomes my faithful friend. Affection becomes duty. Humanity becomes monarchy. Still, you can sense her ghost in the margins. Her words have that peculiar warmth that survives censorship. The pause is too long. The adjectives too soft. They pulse faintly, like the heartbeat of a secret refusing to die. Every few years, the debate flares again. Documentaries, biographies, gossip pieces with clickbait titles like The Queen and Her Highland Flame. Scholars lecture about boundaries, class structures, and emotional dependency. But underneath all the clever analysis, you can feel it, a stubborn tenderness that no archive can bleach away. And maybe that's what disturbs her descendants most, not the scandal, but the fact that the most powerful woman of her age dared to need someone the world considered beneath her. In Balmoral's quiet gardens, visitors still pause before the statue, some unaware of the story, others whispering bits of rumor. The inscription remains, weathered but legible. Friend more than servant. It's the kind of phrase that outlives the politics that tried to bury it. So you linger there a little longer, as dusk deepens, and the air smells of wet stone and pine. Somewhere between shadow and history, you think you hear a chuckle carried on the wind. A man's voice, low and amused. Maybe the ghosts never left. Maybe they just learned to wait. You stand now in the soft quiet of the present, where the empire has long since crumbled into memory, and the great queen who once ruled half the globe has been reduced to a face on postage stamps. And yet, somehow, her story still breathes every time someone asks who she truly was behind that solemn gaze. You already know the answer: a monarch divided between crown and heart. History has never been comfortable with that. It wants its rulers made of marble, not flesh. But you've seen what the marble hides. You've walked those shadowed hallways, heard the creak of her writing desk, smelled the paper where tears once fell. The truth is, Queen Victoria lived to parallel lives, one for her empire, and one for a man the empire wished to erase. Even now, historians still argue whether her attachment to John Brown was a romance, a dependency, or simply the grief of a lonely woman who refused to die of decorum. The official biographies, carefully edited, present a widow draped eternally in duty. Yet the unofficial whispers, those found in her handwriting, in photographs she never meant for public eyes, speak of laughter, teasing, even rebellion. One of her surviving letters includes a curious line: "I am never so well as." When you are near, it could be read as maternal affection or something much deeper. But either way, it cracks the perfect porcelain image of a queen untouched by want. And that's the point, isn't it? The power of her secret wasn't in the scandal, it was in the humanity it revealed. After all, this was a woman who outlasted every prime minister of her time, who saw her name stamped across continents, who defined an entire era, and yet she was still undone by love. Not destroyed, but softened, grounded, made mortal. In a strange, almost cinematic symmetry, the later years of her reign mirror the early days of her widowhood. The circle closes, the empire begins to fade, her children scatter across Europe, and the world grows too modern for her Victorian certainties. Through it all, she keeps that photograph of Brown, hidden beneath the lace, as if daring the next generation to find it and understand. And when she finally exhales her last breath at Osborne House, perhaps she imagined that he was there, waiting in the mist beyond the window. Maybe she thought of Balmoral, the hills, the laughter, the rough accent that once dared to call her woman, not your majesty. It's tempting to say that her love was forbidden, but that gives too much credit to the rules she quietly broke. What she had with Brown wasn't rebellion, it was release. It was a reminder that even monarchs crave the ordinary warmth of being seen, not served. And maybe that's why their story refuses to stay buried. Because in the end, it isn't just about a queen and her servant. It's about the parts of ourselves that long for connection. Even when the world insists we should rise above it, the scandal fades, the names weather. But love, especially the inconvenient kind, has a way of echoing across centuries. And somewhere, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear her laughter in the Scottish wind. Now the candles are nearly gone, their flames shrinking into soft orange pearls. The story has quieted, to its sharp edges smoothed by time. You can almost picture her ghost walking through Balmoral's corridors tonight, the hem of her gown brushing the stones, whispering to a man no one else can see. Let the world keep its myths of grandeur. The real truth, the tender one, lies in moments like that, in the touch of a rough hand against a gloved one, in laughter echoing through fog, in secrets folded carefully beneath royal silk. You think of how she carried that memory through 50 long years, and maybe you understand something she never could say aloud, that the greatest crown we ever wear is the one love places quietly on our hearts. The night settles around you now, heavy and soft. The empire has fallen asleep, and so should you. Breathe slower. Imagine the hills of Scotland under moonlight, the rustle of pines, the faraway call of an owl. Somewhere, a statue still stands watch, a bronze guardian of a love that outlasted gossip, politics, and time itself. And as the last thought drifts across your mind, it's this: even queens are allowed to be human. Sweet dreams.